Okay, let's go over to Psalm 13. It's an interesting little psalm. Um, I want you to remember that the lament psalms are about spiritual, mental, and physical suffering, questioning God because his actions are not consistent with how the psalmist thinks he ought to be acting. The psalmist looks at God and says, why are you acting that way? Okay, and that's what these psalms deal with. So this psalm begins with two interesting figures of speech about the word how long. One of them is asking questions without waiting for or expecting an answer. He just races through them. He asks four questions, boom, 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 without even stopping for an answer. The second one is repetition. We've talked about repetition of things. When things are said more than one time, they're usually said they're repeated to add emphasis to what's being stated. So he's talking about how long. So he says it four times, so he's adding emphasis to that word, those words, how long. And we're going to see what that emphasis is for as we go through it. In the first two verses, the psalmist asks four questions, beginning with the words, how long. There's no time to receive an answer, and for sure, repetition of these words, how long, adds interest and intensity to the question. All right, let's look at verse 1, and let me read verse 1 and 2. How long, O Lord? How long, O Lord, will you forget me? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and every day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? How long will my enemy triumph over me? All right. In verse 1, David seems to think God has forgotten him. This is what David thinks from the human perspective. It's not what we think, it's not what we know. It's what David was thinking at the time that he wrote this. He's thinking that God may have forgotten him. And that's from the human perspective. It's the way he feels. And he will never be remembered. That means forget. He's forgotten and he will never be remembered. He has been forgotten forever. We know about the question of forever. God's anger may endure for a night or for a time, but his love abides forever. We know he doesn't forget forever. But David is going through some problems, and this is how he felt. He feels like God has forgotten him forever. Then in the next statement, he seems to think that God has forsaken him. When he says, hide your face from me. He actually said, how long will you hide your face from me? That sounds like he's forsaken him, like he's just turned his back on him. These are where the disorientation statements begin, which we talked about in Psalm 73. He's disoriented. David obviously he was properly oriented at some point in his faith in God, but something has happened where he's gotten disoriented. So now he's feeling forgotten and he's feeling forsaken. So now we're getting into the lament part of this. Later he will come back to be reoriented when we get to 5 and 6, but right now he's going into this disoriented phase in his faith with God. We need to be clear on the nature of forget and forsake, about what it actually means. If you forget something, it's accidental and it's uncontrolled. You don't have any control over it. If you forget it, right? Unless you selectively forget. That's a different kind of forget. But if you forget something, it's accidental. Forsake, on the other hand, requires a conscious effort. You have to say, I am going to forsake you. I'm going to forsake that, whatever it is. So you got two things. One is accidental, and uncontrolled. This is from the human perspective, not from God's perspective, because He never forgets anything, right? But from the human perspective, to forget is accidental. To forsake is intentional. And that's the way David is looking at this. So David is not asking for him, when he says how long, he said it 4 times, right? He's not asking for information. He's not wanting God to say it's going to be 3 hours and 21 more minutes. He's just saying, how long do I have to wait? David is expressing misgivings about God's character, like Asaph did. Remember what Asaph in Psalm 73? He was questioning God's goodness when he was going through this disoriented phase of his life. He was questioning the character of God's goodness. Okay? David is going through painful experiences, and he is seeking to understand how God does not act the way David desires. Why are you acting like you're acting? It's the same thing with Asaph. Why do you remember what Asaph was seeing? He was seeing all the evil people being rewarded financially in Psalm 73, and he was wondering, why can you reward them? They're evil. You're not rewarding me. David is looking at whatever he's going to be looking at, and he's seeing God has forgotten him, and he's forsaken him, and he just doesn't think God ought to be acting that way. David is expressing impatience with God, just as we do. When do we want our answers? Now. See, she hasn't even been in here for what? Nearly an hour now. She's already getting the answers right. We want it now. He's expressing impatience. So verse 2, I already read it. I'll read it again. But verse 2 said, how long must I wrestle with my thoughts and every day have sorrow in my heart? David is still on the question of how long, but he is focusing on his thoughts, on his problem, rather than focusing on God. That's what we do, right? We have a problem, and we try to deal with it on our own until we get to the point where we say, I have to have you, God. Then I'll handle this one. When I need you, I'll call you. Well, he's calling him now. He's been focusing on his own thoughts. And it's what is bringing sorrow to his heart, because he's having to deal with it himself, and he can't. It's hurting his heart, giving him sorrow over it, because he can't understand it. The last part of that verse says we do not see here that David has a sin problem. You know, in chapter 40, we saw he had a sin problem. And some of the others we looked at in 53, I believe it was, in chapter 7, it seems like he had a sin problem. We're not seeing that here. He hasn't said that yet anyway. But his enemies do play into the anguish, so much so that he feels that his problem may lead to his death. That's a pretty big problem. See, we don't have those kind of problems. I mean, we don't have those kind of enemies. We might have, but generally, I don't know if anybody wants to kill me. You know, I don't feel like I need to run from somebody because they're trying to kill me. David did. Look at verse 3, what it says there. Look at me and answer, O Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. It looks like David is saying to God that you are taking so long that I may die before I get an answer. That's kind of what he's saying. And I felt that way before, you know, because of this. You know, just seemed like a long period of time, but it may not be that long in terms of actual, you know, waiting requires a passage of time. No matter how long it is, if you're waiting, your clock is going to tick around. But it just seems like I'm going to die before I get an answer. Not necessarily, but it can be. It can be. That's what you got to realize. People want to draw on that verse, say a day to the Lord is like 1,000 years for us. Well, that can be true, but it's not always true, necessarily. Okay. Did I read? Yeah, I was talking about 3. It looks like David is saying to God that you are taking so long that I may die before I get an answer. And if that happens, what are his enemies going to do? They're going to rejoice. Did it say that in verse 3? Okay, it gets to verse 4. So verse 4 says this: my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. If we had enemies, such as David has, guys that want to kill him, who want to physically kill him, then they would rejoice and claim victory when he died, right? I wanted to kill him, and guess what I did? I killed him, so I'm victorious. Yay for me. We have no such enemies. So how does this apply to us? Literally, I mean, it's talking about enemies trying to kill him. I don't have any enemies that want to kill me except one. What is his name? So you got 2 answers already. Satan. Okay. We have no such enemies, but we do have an enemy called Satan. He is out to defeat us, and in his mind, defeat us. We know through Christ the sting of death has been removed, and death has no consequence. He thought he was victorious when Jesus died on the cross, right? That was just the start of his problems. Okay, but while we are alive, Satan can cause much despair through consequences of our actions, or his effect on others can affect us directly. He may be causing us grief, but our grief may be coming from other people who Satan is working on. Okay? So that's the kind of situation we're dealing with here. Then in verse 5, now we're getting to the reorientation of his thinking. The proper orientation isn't in the psalm, but we know that David is a man after God's own heart, so we know that he was properly oriented. Then he has this problem where he's getting disoriented, where he feels forgotten and forsaken. Now he's coming back to the reorientation in his thinking, and here's what 5 and 6 say. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation, and I will sing to the Lord, for he has been good to me. That reorientation is expressed in 3 key thoughts. One is his unfailing love, one is in rejoicing, and one is in singing. In his unfailing love, this use of the word love has more to do with loyalty and allegiance. I mean, God loves us. It has more to do with loyalty and allegiance than it does with emotion. You know, I love you, I love you, I love you. But the kind of love we're talking about here is God's love, where he's expressing loyalty and allegiance to David. More than emotion. His loyalty never fails. God is loyal. He's made promises, and if he makes a promise, you can count on it. He says, I love you. His love will be unfailing. And he says rejoicing, because he said, my heart rejoices in your salvation, because he recognizes that God does not forget or forsake. He recognizes salvation and rejoices because of it. And then the singing, he says, I will sing to the Lord, for he's been good to me. He sings because he recognizes that God has dealt bountifully with him. And I say bountifully because that's what the King James says. It says bountifully. David expresses God's goodness to him personally This is, in essence, a refutation of the charge of being forgotten and forever and forsaken. He's taking that back. Okay, and he's taking it back because he states that God has dealt with him bountifully from the King James, and bountiful means full to overflow of it. But it's just an interesting thing to see how these they're called the lament psalms, okay, and every one of them deals with a problem that the psalmist is having, some kind of problem, mental, physical, spiritual. And every one of them deals with him having to work through his own thoughts because he is trying to evaluate God's performance. And he said, "You're just not acting the way I think you ought to be acting." And then he comes back to a proper orientation. And when he gets back to that proper orientation, he's freed up to worship God more fully, because that burden of questioning God's goodness, or questioning whether he loves him, whether he questions his forgiving nature, or his forsaking, whether he's forsaking me or not. Once that's removed, then you are free. You don't have that burden on you anymore. You're free to worship. Okay, that's all I got for today.